I suppose when we think about Westminster, the thing that comes to mind is the Parliament in London. And so when we think about the Westminster Confession of Faith, we might wonder what on earth it has to do with that Parliament. But the fact is that the Westminster Assembly of Divines was called into being, it was established by the London Parliament in 1643. And the reason for this was to look to reorganise the Church of England and to bring it more in line with the church in Scotland. And underlying this were political reasons, looking for alliances. It took 5 years' work for the divines to come up with the Westminster Confession of Faith, and it was finally accepted and ratified by the London Parliament in 1648. In content, it looks at issues of theological orthodoxy and of ecclesial governance. But I'm an unsubscriber. I don't subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, so I don't intend going into the what it includes. If you'd like to find that out, it's easily available online. You can easily search for it, and in good non-subscribing tradition, read it for yourself. I would, however, like to think a little bit more about the why, and most particularly about the when. 1643, the English Civil War was underway. 1648, the Westminster Confession of Faith was adopted by the London Parliament, and in January the following year, Charles I was beheaded. He was executed on the scaffold. These were turbulent and difficult times, and the when of all of this was critical. But to be able to understand that, and it's complicated, let's be honest, we need to look back a century earlier, and we need to look at the different trajectories that the Reformation took in England and in Scotland. In England, the Articles of Faith, the 39 Articles of Faith, began to be drawn up in a process that started in the 1530s. In the 1530s. And we might remember that it was in the 1530s that Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn. And so the Articles of Faith for the Church of England are to do with establishing the monarch as the head of the church and looking at an Episcopalian structure. In Scotland, something very different happened. The Scottish Reformation was led by a man called John Knox. Now, John Knox did spend a time as an honorary chaplain to Henry VIII's son Edward, but he had to flee when Mary Tudor came to the throne because, of course, she sought to overthrow the English Reformation, and he fled to Geneva. And in Geneva, he came under the influence of John Calvin. And so Scottish Presbyterianism, if we were to describe it in a nutshell, is Calvinism filtered through the lens of John Knox. Now, in Scotland at that time, the ruling party, really Scotland, was ruled by Mary of Guise. Mary of Guise was a French woman and Catholic, and she was the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, became queen when she was only a few days old, and so her mother had a great deal of influence in the country at the time. And actually, Mary, Queen of Scots, was at first Queen Consort in France. She was married to the French king, and so her mother had a great deal of power in Scotland. John Knox did not approve. In 1558, he produced the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women. Now, that's sometimes misunderstood as the monstrous regiment of women, which has me imagining a horde of Tudor suffragettes marching through Edinburgh to besiege John Knox in his home. But it's the monstrous regimen, the monstrous rule of women that he is objecting to, thinking of the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Mary herself. 2 years later, in 1560, John Knox supervises the production of the Scots Confession of Faith. And so as early as 1560, the Scots already have their own confession. If we look to Ireland, where there was also great unrest, first of all, we find that the plantation of particularly Ulster began at the beginning of the 17th century, and this brought the dissenting tradition into Ireland from both England and Scotland. And there are two different sets of dissent to be considered in that. There's the very strongly Calvinistic tradition in Scotland, and there's a different tradition in England. The English Puritans, largely, we may think of, but we might think of other groups. One of the best known are the Levellers, And the Levellers, of course, were concerned with issues of democracy and increasing education. So a lot of different ideas coming into different parts of Ulster and also different parts of Ireland at that time. And in 1615, we find Archbishop Usher. It's probably Archbishop Usher. He's the one who's famous for determining the date of creation, and he's largely lampooned for this nowadays. But this is a very serious scholarly study at the time, and he was a great scholar of his time. And it's probably he who oversees the Irish Articles of Faith in 1615, and these are Calvinistic in tone, but we have issues going on about the relationship between the Church of Ireland, the Irish development of the Church of England, and the Presbyterians in particular, the dissenters at this time. And these Articles of Faith that are developed in Ireland have a strong influence on the development of the Westminster Confession when it comes into play in the 1640s. So we see behind this a huge mixture of political and religious interventions as Catholicism and Protestantism are being fought over, and a society is being formed at this time. And so the Westminster Confession of Faith is a part of this process. And it becomes very strongly dominant in various forms of dissenting traditions, particularly Scottish Presbyterianism. But with the Restoration in England, when the monarchy is reintroduced in England in 1660 and Charles II comes to the throne, Parliament eventually introduces laws that phase out the provisions of the Westminster Confession in England. And so the Church of England returns to the 39 Articles of Faith, but the Westminster Confession remains dominant for Presbyterianism. But it is introduced after the dissenting tradition itself begins to develop. And so the non-subscribers were to see themselves in not subscribing to the Confession of Faith as keeping true to what they saw to be the essential elements of Presbyterianism. And this takes us on into the first subscription controversy in Ireland in the 1720s and the events that lead up to that. And in the midst of that, the establishment of our congregation in Moneyreagh. But these are topics for next week.